Many fast engines have made their way to the island of Sodor in the TV series, but who is the fastest of them all? As the show went on, it frequently contradicted itself on who the fastest engine was.
This is Spencer. He's the fastest engine in the world.
Hugo's the fastest engine in the world.
Etienne recently set the world rail speed record.
Spencer was stated to be the fastest engine in the world in his debut in Season 7. This is reinforced by a later character promo which states he holds the world speed record for steam locomotives.
In fact, Spencer still holds the world land speed record for steam locomotives.
This is technically incorrect. This record is actually held by the real-life engine Mallard, which is one of Spencer's class, an A4 Pacific. Are they implying Spencer is supposed to be Mallard? Mallard's record was 126 miles per hour. While indeed a feat, it was a special occasion. Usually A4s went around 90 to 100 miles per hour, so we'll assume Spencer probably goes these speeds on the regular, although is probably capable of more. Next up we have Connor, who is a streamlined New York Central Hudson, whose typical speeds were as high as 123 miles per hour, making him just a bit faster than Spencer on the regular, and also making him faster than him in the show accurate.
That?
Connor is the show's fastest steam engine, although not the fastest. Kenji is a Zero Series Shinkansen, a bullet train from Japan who briefly visited Sodor. The Shinkansen's top speed is 220 kilometers an hour, or 137 miles per hour. That's pretty fast, but still not the fastest. The fastest engine on Sodor is Hugo, the Rail Zeppelin. Hugo is alluded to being the actual Rail Zeppelin of Germany, which had a top speed of 143 miles an hour. Hugo, of course, is an anomaly and not your conventional engine. The fastest engine of the series is Etienne, the French Electric. Etienne is alluded to being the real 9004, which in real life broke the world speed record for a locomotive in 1955 at 331 kilometers an hour, or roughly 205 miles an hour. The only character in the series to go over 200.
Au revoir!
Etienne never came to Sodor though, thus making Hugo the fastest engine on the island. In one of the earliest stories of the book series, and later an episode of the TV series, the engine named Henry refused to exit a tunnel because he didn't want to get his paint wet in the rain. No matter what the passengers tried, they couldn't get him to move. Frustrated with Henry's stubbornness, the controller of the railway, i.e. the Fat Controller, walled Henry up and left him in the tunnel until further notice. And that's where the story ends. The story is aptly called The Sad Story of Henry. The misconception here is that Henry was left in the tunnel forever after this, and presumably died there. This is a funny misconception to me because the only people who fall for this are people who have very clearly never seen the show. The Sad Story of Henry is a part 1 of a two-parter. The second part, called Edward Gordon and Henry, shows him being let out. The Fat Controller never intended to leave Henry there forever. The US dub even altered a line to assure the audience the walling up wasn't permanent.
"We shall take away your rails," he said, "and leave you here until you're ready to come out of the tunnel."
The Fat Controller always intended to let him out eventually. This misconception is unusually bewildering because every release of this episode, whether on TV, or on home media, or in book form, has always paired it with Part 2. There is such a small chance that someone saw only the Part 1 and didn't see the Part 2. If you ever saw him get bricked up, you very likely saw him get let out. So why do people further this misconception that Henry died in the tunnel? Clickbait. The answer is clickbait. It's all just a lie to further a narrative that isn't real to get your clicks. On real steam engines, the front of their smokebox is a circular door that opens up so the crew can sweep out all the ashes that build up in there while the engine was in steam. In the Thomas universe, of course, the location of the doors is where their faces are. So naturally, most of us think, well, I guess the engines just don't have smokebox doors in this universe. I always thought Henry's sneeze was supposed to be an in-joke to this. that the engines all build up ash because there's no way to clear it out. But that's not the case, as confirmed by the story Out of Puff in the Railway series book, Henry and the Express.
The fireman cleared away more ashes, but when he tried to close Henry's smokebox door, it did not make the airtight fit that it should have done.
The text clearly states Henry's crew clears out his ashes and then attempt to shut his smokebox door. Of course, the illustrations don't show this, but it means the faces are the doors and open up like this. I hate it, 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 I hate it. Imagine if they opened up like this in CGI. Like Gordon and James are arguing or something, and then wham! Gordon opens his face and looks directly at James next to him. That just might be the creepiest thought ever, and I don't think I'll be able to sleep tonight. Thomas the Tank Engine is an E2 class tank engine from the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway. He is specifically one of the variants with the extended side tanks, which means he would have been built in 1915 with that batch of the class, making him 107 years old in 2022. He's old. But get this. Gordon is an A1 from the Great Northern Railway, technically the prototype A1. He came to Sodor soon after his construction in 1921, meaning he is actually younger than Thomas. While they're only about 6 years apart, it's still weird to think that Thomas is technically older than Gordon. Speaking of weird ages, Thomas and Toby are nearly the same age, which feels very wrong because of how each engine is characterized. Thomas is always depicted as a younger, hot-headed type, while Toby is the funny old grandpa. All the more weird when you realize Toby, aka J70 tram engine number 127 from the Great Eastern Railway, was built in 1914, only a year before Thomas. I don't really get how ages work with engines. I guess it all depends on how they feel. Gordon's Hill is the steepest grade of railway track on the island of Sodor, based on the Lickey Incline in England. It got its nickname because Gordon was famously the first engine to get stuck on it. In the TV show, Gordon's Hill is depicted as a giant hill that the trains climb over and then slide down the other side of. Wellsworth is the station at the bottom on the west side, and Meron is the station at the bottom on the east side. There are many episodes where the engines pull trains up the hill coming from the west, lose control, and then crash at Meron. This is technically inaccurate, because the TV show misinterpreted the hill. In the books, Gordon's Hill is a steep gradient, yes, but only coming from the west. Wellsworth is at the bottom, then it's a climb up, and Meron rests at the top of the hill. In the story Thomas and the Trucks, Thomas departs Vickerstown coming from the east heading towards Edward Station, aka Wellsworth. He loses control on the hill going down it, and comes to a stop at Wellsworth. Since the TV series ignored that Vickerstown was the big station in the first two books, Thomas instead departs Knapford and goes the other direction heading east, now making him climb the hill with weirdly no issue. Later episodes would go on to contradict this. It's fascinating how many little details the TV show actually got wrong that went on to impact the entire franchise. There is a common misbelief among people that the Fat Controller, aka Sir Topham Hatt, is an evil fascist dictator that treats his sentient engines like slaves. They must do what he says or he'll scrap them or lock them up in tunnels to starve to death. This obviously isn't true. It's fun to point at the funny looking fat guy with the top hat and say he's evil, but he really isn't. Anyone who's ever watched the show can easily tell he's a fatherly authority figure that cares about his engines. Something to remember here is that the engines are not people. They don't necessarily have or desire free will in the same way humans do. The engines can only move around if there's people starting them up to do so, unlike something like the Pixar cars, where the machines are totally alive and are independent from human intervention. The engines are actual man-operated machines just like in the real world. They just happen to be alive. They have completely different desires and aspirations than humans do. Humans want free will to pursue whatever kind of life they desire ultimately, while an engine's desire is a lot more simple than that. They don't necessarily want free will. They want to be used. They want to be in service. They want to operate. They want to be useful. An apt comparison would be the Toy Story series. A toy's desire is to be played with by its owner. If their owner doesn't use them, then they feel they have no purpose. Is Andy an evil fascist dictator in this scenario? No, not at all. An even better comparison would be dogs. Dogs have owners and don't really desire free will. They just want to be taken care of. As long as they're loved and they get to go out on walks and are fed on the daily, they're totally happy. The engines are basically dogs, just with a higher level of intelligence. I view the Fat Controller with the same sort of morals as someone like a general manager of a heritage railway. Every decision made is with the notion in mind that the railway must be kept running, and that the engines must be taken care of. Fans of the series will know that the Fat Controller has never actually scrapped any of his engines.
Why did you think I would scrap the master of the railway, Thomas?
He punishes them when they're naughty, just like any authority figure would, but he never threatens them with death threats. He's actually gone out of his way and used his wealth to save engines that were in danger of being killed off, most notably Oliver in the episode Escape. This man is a savior of engines, not a dictator. He is certainly not evil. Scruffey was an old dilapidated wagon that caused a lot of trouble for Oliver, and one of the few characters to actually have a shown death in the books. In the original story, Toad Stands By, Scruffey accidentally met his maker when Oliver tried pulling him forward and the trucks behind him held their brakes on. Getting stretched between them, Scruffey was ripped in half. In this story, Scruffey was broken up afterwards and scrapped, accompanied by this incredibly creepy picture of his remains where he still looks like he's alive. Ugh. The TV adaptation of this story changes the ending. Scruffey does indeed get ripped in half still, but he gets repaired at the end and is said to have learned his lesson.
Scruffey has learned his lesson and says nothing at all.
And because they changed the ending, you'd think that means they did it because they thought killing him off was too morbid for the TV series, right? Wrong. In the next season, they ended up killing him anyway, but in a completely unrelated way. In the Season 5 episode Put Upon Percy, Scruffey reappears at the front of a train stuck in a coal mine. Percy dislodges it, but the train breaks away and runs loose into the mineshaft. Scruffey derails, hits a support beam, and the roof caves in, burying him alive. There's no chance they saved him either, because the entire mine collapsed. Good lord. Scruffey does inexplicably make a blink-and-you'll-miss-it reappearance in the episode Double Teething Troubles later in the season, so maybe he did get rescued? Or perhaps this episode takes place before Put Upon? Who knows? I don't know what's a worse fate, being ripped in half or being buried alive. Poor guy. R.I.P. Scruffey. Here's an interesting fact that only pertains to the original Railway series books. First of all, what is a push-pull? Usually when a train reaches the end of the line, the engine has to run around the train to the other end to pull it back down the line, usually going backwards. In a push-pull consist, the engine never disconnects from the front. The driver instead goes to the rear coach, which will have special controls to operate the train's speed. The engine then pushes the train in reverse back down the line. It pulls it one way and pushes it the other. In the TV show, Thomas is always depicted as pulling Annie and Clarabelle going forwards. He is never seen running around and pulling them in reverse. The CGI episode Thomas the Babysitter confirmed that the end of his branch line has a loop that he goes around to switch directions, so he never has to uncouple from the coaches.
Thomas went to turn round on the loop, ready for his return to Knapford.
In the books, however, Thomas is indeed a push-pull. When he reaches the end of the line, his driver goes into Clarabelle and he reverses the train. This is why Annie, and more importantly, Clarabelle, was illustrated with windows on her face end, so the driver can see ahead when she's traveling forwards. These windows carried over to their TV props. As we can see in various illustrations, Thomas is pushing Annie and Clarabelle in reverse, such as here, or has a red tail lamp on his front, such as here, signifying he's going in reverse, and his front is the rear of the train. There are a few instances in the books where Thomas can be seen pulling Annie and Clarabelle in reverse. This is obviously just because of inconsistency, but we can explain this away by saying the special equipment to join Thomas's controls to Clarabelle's were out of order, and thus the consist had to be pulled traditionally. Busy going backwards, you could say. Knapford Station has always consistently been the big terminus station at the start of the main line in the show, ever since the very first episode. However, this isn't the case in the original Railway series books. In the books, Tidmouth is the big station, and is the major hub for the railway. The big canopy station is here, the big engine sheds, and the big harbor where all the ships come in. Knapford is actually just a small junction for Thomas's branch line, and it's here where Thomas meets and chats with the other characters. It really is a head-scratcher why they changed this for the show. It seems like such a random change. But I have a theory why. My theory is that series concept artist Robert Gauld Gallier, who drew up all the preliminary drawings for each set, was looking at the available Island of Sodor map at the time. This would have been the 1971 map, which very incorrectly shows the main line, aka the Black Line, ending at Knapford and not Tidmouth above it. Not sure how that happened. If that's the case, then it's really funny how a single little error like that impacted the entire legacy of the show, and all the toys and merch they've made of the big Knapford Station. They're all technically incorrect. The story, Thomas's Train, is probably one of the more sillier ones from Wilbert Awdry's tenure. Even I wondered how Thomas could have been so stupid in this. In this story, Thomas is allowed to pull a passenger train for the first time, but he's so impatient that he leaves the station too early before his coaches are coupled up to him. He goes a significant amount of distance down the line, thinking he's pulling his train, only to be halted by a signalman who informs him of his mistake, and an embarrassed Thomas limps back to the station. I have always questioned how Thomas didn't realize he wasn't pulling anything. He pushed coaches around before this, surely he knows how heavy they are. It's odd that he didn't feel the lack of weight behind him. The episode maximizes this glaring issue by having Thomas travel what looks like miles before being stopped somewhere down the line. The CGI adaptation in The Adventure Begins has Thomas travel even further before he's halted, passing multiple signal boxes on his journey. The original story actually makes a bit more sense than you think. Since we don't have a good idea of the whole layout of Vicarstown, we couldn't really tell how far Thomas went going by the illustrations. However, this track plan of Vicarstown, drawn up by Wilbert Awdry himself, shows that Thomas, in fact, only got as far as the yard entrance. The signal box he stops at is the one for the station yard. If the camera somehow switched directions here, we'd see the station behind Thomas. So in the original story, he only went a few hundred yards or so before being stopped. Still super silly he didn't notice the lack of weight behind him, but hey, he was excited. No doubt blinded by that rush of adrenaline. Rheneas is one of the narrow gauge engines that works on the Skarloey Railway. He, along with his brother Skarloey, are the oldest working engines on Sodor. But did you know that you've been saying his name incorrectly this whole time? We have always pronounced it as Rheneas, thanks to the TV show, which again misinterpreted how to say it. That wasn't exclusive to only one dub or anything. It's all English-speaking dubs. Every narrator and voice actor has always pronounced it as Rheneas.
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 Rheneas. Rheneas.
In the books, the correct pronunciation is Rheneas, kinda like Phineas, as said by all the original book narrators.
Rheneas saved our railway.
I miss Rheneas very much.
But Rheneas heard nothing.
I'm not exactly sure where Rheneas came from. I guess that was just the TV crew going off what it looks like in written form. While we're on the topic of pronunciations, Farquhar is also incorrect. The show has always called it Farquhar, as it looks like it's spelt.
My favourite station is Farquhar.
Thomas left Farquhar.
However, the original pronunciation is Farker, sort of like Fokker, as said again in the book narrations.
At Farquhar she meant Daisy.
However, unlike Rheneas, they weren't consistent with this, as later book narrations do indeed say Farquhar.
Thomas stood at Farquhar, the top station of his branch line.
So, either pronunciation is technically correct. Farquhar or Farquhar, whichever you prefer really. Personally, I think Farquhar sounds a hell of a lot funnier. We are all so used to the engines being the classes Wilbert Awdry described them as. Thomas has always been known as an E2 class. Gordon is an A1, etc. The Scottish twin engines Donald and Douglas have always been known as Caledonian 812s. Well, this technically isn't true. The Caledonian Railway 812s were constructed up until 1899. 79 812s were built at this point, and one of them, number 828, is preserved. In 1908, more were built, although with some small construction changes, such as stronger frames and a revised reversing rod shape. These new engines looked virtually identical to 812s, but they were given the class name 652s. 17 of these were built, and made up the last numbers of the class. The last number of the class was 661, and later renumbered by British Railways to 57645. Donald and Douglas are fictional add-on members. The Fat Controller ordered specifically 57646.
Engines have numbers, Inspector. We bought number 57646. Send the other one back.
Which would have been the number after the actual last 652. Donald held this number. This means that Donald and Douglas were built with the 652 class batch, and so are technically 652s, not 812s. Visually, they look barely any different to 812s, so using an 812 for a model of them would still be accurate.
Oh, Kaya!
I know this is confusing because the class names are numbers, but trust me, they're not 812s.
Now then, which of you is 57646? Oh, that's, is just what we kinda mind.
Percy the Small Engine is old. Way older than you think. So old that he just may be as old as Edward. I say may because we don't actually have a solid build date for Percy, since he technically is not based on an actual engine in real life. Edward is. Edward is a Furness Railway K2, built in 1896, making him one of the few standard gauge engines on the island of Sodor, built in the 19th century. Percy has always been depicted as a cheeky young character, younger than Thomas. In the show, they really amp this up and make him more naive and sometimes childishly stupid.
Express engines don't pull trucks. It wouldn't be dignified. Dinghy fried. What's that?
While we don't have a build date for Percy, Wilbert Awdry states that he was built by the Avonside Engine Company, with components of Hunslet found on him. Most people look towards a similar saddle tank engine built by Avonside in real life called Trojan, which is preserved and looks very similar to Percy. Trojan was built in 1897. If we want to go by the logic that Percy was built around the same time as Trojan, that would make him only a year younger than Edward, and also making Percy one of the oldest working engines on the island of Sodor. My brain is just unable to comprehend that.
Dinghy fried.
The Ballyhoo Tunnels, or more commonly known as Henry's Tunnel, has a very interesting history, as told to us by Wilbert Awdry in the Island of Sodor book. Awdry states that the illustrations for Henry's Tunnel in the first book are inaccurate, and of course the TV series replicated the illustrations, so the tunnel in the show is inaccurate too. Henry's Tunnel was built during the early years of the Northwestern Railway in 1915. Speed and cheapness were paramount, so instead of building two bores, only a single wide one was built, and the up and down lines were gauntleted. Gauntleted tracks are two sets of tracks that overlap each other, meaning that one train can only use the bit of track at a time, and a train coming in the other direction has to wait. As depicted by Luke Ryan here, it was all the more an inconvenience when Henry stayed in the tunnel and refused to move. He was essentially blocking the main line. There wasn't another tunnel for other engines to pass through. It was only after the Henry incident that the tunnel was nicknamed Henry's Tunnel, and a second tunnel was bored for the other line. During the first tunnel's construction, the ground gave way, creating a cutting and turning what was one tunnel into two separate ones. Henry's Tunnel specifically is the shorter eastern one. Henry's Tunnel is pretty dang interesting. It's definitely not boring. Boo! Depending on what version of the series you're taking in, the actual first engine on the island of Sodor changes. The TV show has never been consistent with this, contradicting itself at various times. It's implied Skarloey and Rheneas are the oldest engines at one point, and then they contradict that in later seasons when they weirdly make Sir Handel older than them.
Older than Sir Handel?
Sometimes they state Edward is the oldest engine.
Edward has worked on the railway the longest.
And then the movie, Hero of the Rails, throws all continuity out the window and states Hero was the first engine.
I was one of the first steam engines to arrive on Sodor.
But then they even contradict that later with the introduction of Glyn. Which is it? We're going to look at the book's continuity to answer this question, which is way more consistent. The first ever railway on the island of Sodor was a plateway built between the wharf at Balladwale and the slate mine in Ward Fell. It was called the Railroad and opened in 1806. This railway, however, was horse-worked and never had engines. The second railway on the island was the Cronk and Harwick Railway, which opened in 1850 in the north of the island. However, this was also a horse-worked line and had no engines. The third railway on the island was the Sodor and Mainland Railway, opened in 1853. This railway owned 3 box tank engines, one of which was named Neil. Neil was the second engine, and the first and third one's names are unknown. The railway's attitude to records was casual, and there aren't many exacts listed on the acquisition of the engines. So we don't know the exact year they arrived. However, they were present on the island by the time Skarloey arrived in 1865. There were no other engines known on Sodor before this, thus making the box tanks the first ever engines on Sodor, and assuming the number 1 arrived first. The box tanks are long scrapped now, which would make Skarloey the oldest surviving engine on the island of Sodor, but not the first one. There are 3 certainties in life: death, taxes, and engine numbers. Almost every engine in the Thomas series has a number, with some exceptions of course. Engines 1 through 11 of course are numbered so because that was the order of their arrivals to the railway. But many of the later characters have seemingly random numbers. They aren't always random though. They all have meanings. Some are obvious of course, such as Stafford, whose number is 1917, which is of course a reference to the year his basis was built. Or Heroes 51, which is a reference to his class number, the D51. Or Salty, who carries the same number as the real-life engine he is based on. However, some of the numbers seem to be without reason, such as Rosie's 37. What on earth is that a reference to? Well, here's a theory. Believe it or not, Rosie is the 37th standard gauge engine introduced in the TV show. Check me. See? Rebecca is number 22. Now you might think this is a reference to the season she was introduced in, season 22. But I think it actually goes a bit further than that. Edward, the number 2 engine, was written out of the main cast in the season 21 episode, A Shed for Edward, and was subsequently replaced by Nia. Rebecca arrived later in season 22, replacing Henry after his departure. However, series producer Ian McHugh revealed in an email to a fan, Rebecca was intended to be introduced in one of the cancelled episodes from season 21, which was cut and carried over to 22. As we can see in her concept art, Rebecca was always intended to be number 22. If she was meant to be in season 21, that'd make her number 22 pretty meaningless, right? Or is it? Here's a theory. As Rebecca would have been introduced before Nia, that means she would have taken Edward's place, the number 2 slot. Could her 22 be a reference to Rebecca being the second number 2? 2 and 2. That is just a theory, of course, but it is kind of sad. What's in a number, right? We all know Oliver, the Great Western Engine, as engine number 11. In the TV series, Oliver wears his 11 on his sides. In the books, Oliver is officially number 11, but as he and Duck both wear their original Great Western liveries, he carries his old number plates, which read 1436. This would mean Oliver's actual number before Sodor is 1436. However, as always, it's a little more complicated than that. The Island of Sodor book states that it's unclear if Oliver really is 1436 or not. He escaped to Sodor with the 1436 plates, but it's doubtful if those were the ones originally given to him. There's many theories to why this is. I personally like the one that Oliver's crew swapped his numbers with an actual scrapped engine to throw British railways off their scent when they escaped. Regardless, one question remains. What is Oliver's actual number? Well, the book illustrations might give us that answer. To understand this one, we have to look at the digitally remastered illustrations from the Railway Series books, as can be found in the 2015 70th Anniversary Collection release. Prior to this release, the illustrations looked like this. However, after the illustrations were rescanned, some of the finer details are quite a bit easier to make out. If you look closely at Oliver's buffer beam here, you'll see the number 1420. This number appears in several illustrations if you look closely, and even appears to be the number on his number plate. 1420 is an actual preserved 1400 class on the South Devon Railway, and my guess is that the illustrators, Peter and Gunvor Edwards, were provided photos of that engine as reference for Oliver, and the number just so happened to be carried over. Could 1420 be Oliver's actual number? Could the engine currently at the South Devon Railway be the real Oliver? Well, there's nothing conclusive to support that, and is likely just a weird anomaly with these illustrations. But it's very interesting that Oliver has been depicted with so many different numbers. All we know for sure is that he is indeed the number 11 engine on the Northwestern Railway. And that's really all that matters. Sticking with the current trend of the engine's numbers, let's talk about some of the real engines that have appeared in the TV series. We of course know the famous ones. Stepney, Flying Scotsman, and City of Truro are all real engines that have appeared in the show at some point. But I'm not talking about them. I want to shed some light on the lesser-known real engines, specifically some of the original ones from the TV show. The Island of Sodor book states Toby was originally BR number 68221 before coming to Sodor, which was an actual J70 tram engine in real life. It originally wore the number 127 when built by the Great Eastern Railway. In real life, 68221 was scrapped in 1951. Salty wears the number 2991, which is an actual number worn by a Class 07 in real life. This 07 is preserved, and is still in active service as of 2022. Neville bears the BR number 33010 on his cab sides. A real Q1 class wore this in real life. It is no longer around, and was scrapped in 1964. Arthur does not wear a visible number in the show. However, his concept art depicts him with one on his bunker. The number 41241 belongs to a real IVAT 2MT that is preserved and currently operating on the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway. This 2MT is painted in red, very similar to Arthur. Dennis, the Lazy Diesel, is based on a prototype diesel built in 1949 and scrapped in 1959. There was only one of this engine built, and it wore the number 11001. Dennis's number is, you guessed it, the same one. Whiff the Garbage engine is based on a real, unique engine called Aerolite, which is preserved at the National Railway Museum in York. Aerolite's job was to haul a saloon coach for the railway's mechanical engineer, while Whiff is an industrial garbage engine. Two very different jobs, but an engine one and the same, as both carry the number 66. Now, of course, there's nothing saying these numbers mean that these characters are, in fact, meant to be the actual engines in real life, but I think they're all pretty interesting to note. Perhaps there are more real engines in the Thomas series than we know. Have you ever pondered just how long the main line on the island of Sodor is? And just how long a journey across the island takes? Well, let's find out as exactly as we can. Here is a faithful recreation of Wilbur Awdry's map of Sodor by user 01Salty. Audrey's map is the most realistic of all the Sodor maps out there, so it is the one that we will be looking at for exacts. According to the key, each box on the map is a square 5 miles. Going by this, the island mass itself is about 60 miles in length. However, the main line isn't a straight line across. It zigs and zags a bit, making it much longer than 60 miles. How do we find out? So I figured we'd go with the old tried and true method and use some string. I printed out the map and placed string along the main line's route. I didn't have regular string, so this festive Christmas string will have to do. I'm sorry, it's all I had. From end to end, the string is about 14.5 inches, or 36.83 centimeters. When printed out, the squares on the map are 2.1 centimeters in length. 2.1 centimeters equals 5 miles, making a single mile about 0.42 centimeters. 36.83 divided by 0.42, and we have a total of 87.69. Sodor's main line is roughly 87.7 miles long, from Tidmouth to Barrow-in-Furness. Now, how long does a journey across the island take? Well, this will of course come down to the speed of the train you're traveling on. If you're on a local stopping train, it's going to take a lot longer. If you're being propelled by the jet engine, it probably takes 10 minutes. I'm going to look to the express for this one, which is mostly non-stop. Let's say an express train runs on average 60 miles per hour the whole journey. Going by this, the journey takes about 87 minutes, give or take. However, there are stops. In the TV series, it seems the express stops at multiple stations. In the books, though, there is only one stop, Crovan's Gate. Let's assume Gordon makes a 10-minute stop at this station, enough time to have a brief chat with Sir Handel, and then continues on. The total journey time is just under 100 minutes, so about an hour and 40 minutes. Keep in mind that none of this is exact, but that seems about right for a landmass that is only 60 miles in length. Not sure why they ever needed a Gresley A1 Pacific to run it, but hey, no one ever said Sodor wasn't a bit extravagant. Skarloey is the station for the lake on the Skarloey Railway, of which the railway is named after. It was originally the railway's terminus, and has changed quite a bit over the years. In recent years, Skarloey Lake has become quite a spot for tourism during the summer months, with 3 major hotels overlooking the lake, and bus services from it to several other scenic spots on the island, including the Culdee Railway. One of the newest attractions to Skarloey is a funicular railway. What is that? A funicular railway is an incline railway in which its 2 cars ascend and descend a steep gradient, being pulled up and down by pulley ropes, kinda similar to how Owen works at the Blue Mountain Quarry. The Skarloey Funicular Railway was built in 1985. It runs from Skarloey Station down the steep hill to the village on the lake. It was a joint venture between the Skarloey Railway and the hotels. The railway built it and takes 51% of the revenue. The hotels take the remaining 49%. I like to imagine the 2 cars that work the gradient would be alive in this universe. Just another pair of friendly faces to chat to the engines when they reach Skarloey Station. Must be a pretty dull life for them though, just going up and down all day, with sights that never change. For a funicular railway, doesn't sound like much of a fun life to me. This is a very fascinating theory fans have speculated about regarding the character of Wilbert. Wilbert is a real-life J94 class saddle tank that operates on the Dean Forest Railway in England. The engine was named in preservation after Wilbert Audrey, and in turn, was turned into a character in the books. When Wilbert visited the island of Sodor, he told Thomas and Toby about another saddle tank he once knew called 16, an engine only known by his number and no name. 16 worked at a steelworks in England. He was careless, and his recklessness caused him to topple cab over wheels one day. He was rescued and later preserved. According to Wilbert, he got better than he deserved, and now runs on a heritage railway in the Midlands. What's interesting about this is that Wilbert is not present in 16's story. It's odd that Wilbert knew all about what happened to 16 without being shown to have actually met him or even worked with him. This has led some fans to believe that Wilbert and 16 are actually the same engine. The incident that happened to 16 actually happened to Wilbert, and Wilbert made up 16 to avoid telling Thomas and Percy that he was actually that careless. This is a super interesting theory. Could it possibly be true? Well, let's dive in. Wilbert is of course meant to be the real Wilbert, so let's look at Wilbert's working history. Wilbert was built in 1953 for the National Coal Board and worked at several collieries, including Staffordshire and Rugeley. He was preserved in 1973 by the Dean Forest Railway, and he's been there ever since, once being named G.B. Keeling in 1981, and later Wilbert. And that's really about it. Wilbert worked at collieries, never at a steelworks. He also never bore the number 16 in his working life. Let's look at 16 now. 16 has never been confirmed to be an actual engine in real life. Interestingly, Wilbert does say that 16 is preserved. Looking at all the preserved J94s out there, the one that wore the same livery as 16 was one called Warrior, who, funnily enough, is also located at the Dean Forest Railway. It spent its working life at Bickerstaff Colliery in Lee, again, not a steelworks. It's possible that 16 is wearing a totally different livery in preservation now, but we'll never know for sure. Going by Wilbert's history, he never worked at a steelworks, and never wore the number 16. So he couldn't actually be 16. However, it is totally possible Wilbert made up the entire story. 16, steelworks, and all. Who's to say 16 actually exists at all? Was it actually Wilbert himself and he fudged the details? Or was Wilbert pulling crap out of his bunker just to entertain Thomas and Toby? Who's to say? Thomas is famously known as the Little Blue No. 1 tank engine. But he wasn't always painted blue. Before coming to Sodor, he actually would have looked quite different. So what did he actually look like before making his way to the Northwestern Railway? Thomas is canonically an E2 class tank engine from the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, or LBSC for short. As stated in the Island of Sodor book, Thomas arrived on Sodor in 1915, still during the pre-grouping years. In the origin story movie, The Adventure Begins, Thomas arrives on Sodor wearing a green paint job with white lining and LBSC painted on his side tanks. He even mentions that he came from Brighton.
Where are you from? Oh, Brighton, on the mainland.
A very nice reference to lore canon, however the paint job isn't a real one. The LBSC never painted any of their engines in green with white lining. Interestingly, the paint job has a lot more in common with the later Southern Railway livery many of the LBSC engines would have later worn. Around the era when Thomas was built, the LBSC's main livery was a very attractive umber brown with gold lining, and most of their passenger engines wore it. A couple E2s were tried out on passenger services and were given this livery. However, this occurred in 1914. Thomas is one of the later E2s with the extended side tanks built in 1915. So he never would have worn brown. Thomas indeed would have worn the very basic LBSC black, as shown here. Not the most exciting livery in the world, and he would have only had it for a very short time, as he went to Sodor the same year he was built. For all we know, he may not have even been painted in a livery. Audrey doesn't state the exacts of how Thomas got to Sodor, so really it's all up to our own imagination. I think most of us agree though, that nothing beats the classic blue. I think we all instinctively associate the Skarloey Railway with Wales, since the real-life Talyllyn Railway it is based on is so heavily associated with it. This is reinforced in the CGI series, when Skarloey and Rheneas gained voice actors and were given Welsh accents.
Actually, I could really use a fresh...
It could have been worse. Luckily, Rheneas is still safe and in good working order.
But what if I told you that Skarloey and Rheneas are actually not Welsh at all? Skarloey and Rheneas, like their real-life counterparts, Talyllyn and Dalgach, were built by Fletcher Jennings in Whitehaven in England. After Talyllyn and Dalgach were built, they were sent to Wales to run their railway, while Skarloey and Rheneas were shipped to the island of Sodor, which is off the coast of Cumbria. At no point in their working lives did Skarloey or Rheneas ever visit Wales. I believe they have both technically visited the Talyllyn and Preservation era, but neither have any Welsh origins, which makes their accents in CGI very questionable.
You have to stop bumping into things, Rheneas.
Their voices are, of course, just a fun reference to the real-life railway, but nonetheless, neither engine has any association with the land of castles. Continuing off the last discussion about Skarloey and Rheneas not being Welsh, let's also talk about Emily. In the UK dub of the show, Emily has always been given a Scottish accent. Michael Angelis first gave her one in Season 7.
Oh, I'm worried about Henry. You're looking so much better. It's no nice to copy the way others speak.
And that carried over to her voice in the CGI series.
Hello, I'm Emily. I came here to bring Henry Victor. He needs his safety valve mended.
As provided by Teresa Gallagher. The accent has become so associated with the character that most fan videos try to replicate it. Well, what if I told you Emily has no Scottish origins at all? Emily is based on the Stirling Single class, designed by Patrick Stirling for the Great Northern Railway. All were built in Doncaster in England. The Great Northern Railway did run trains to Edinburgh in Scotland, but the Stirling Singles never ventured that far on the regular. Patrick Stirling, however, was indeed Scottish, and I think that's where the idea to give Emily a Scottish accent came from. If we want to go with the justification that Emily should be Scottish because her designer was, then surely we'd have to apply that same logic to the other characters, right? Gordon, just like Emily, was built in Doncaster, and also was a part of the Great Northern Railway. He was designed by Sir Nigel Gresley, who was also, indeed, Scottish-born. However, Gordon isn't Scottish, nor is Spencer. Yet, Emily is. I don't really know how the characters' accents work in this series. I always thought it was a matter of where they predominantly worked. Like, they could have been built in Scotland, but if they worked their entire lives in Wales, then they'd have Welsh accents. Perhaps it's a matter of picking up the accents from the people around them when they're first built. Maybe there were just a lot of Scottish people at Doncaster when Emily was new. Who knows? Am I nitpicking here? Oh, absolutely. Though I gotta say, Gordon with a Scottish accent would be pretty fire.
Dinna f***ing think you can lay around my house all day? Go find a f***ing job, you f***ing sausage roll looking twat!
And he puffed away.
Thomas the Tank Engine has many unique traits that make him instantly identifiable. His token blue paint and big number 1, of course, but also his body shape, his extended side tanks, and that sloped front running board, both of which he inherited from the engine he is based on, the E2 class of the London Brighton and South Coast Railway. He has maintained these features throughout the entirety of the TV series. In the books, Thomas lost his sloped running board after the events of the story Thomas Comes to Breakfast. Thomas crashed into the station master's house, twisted his front up, and was sent away to be repaired. He returned home with a flat front, and has maintained it ever since. You're probably wondering, why? What was the reason for this change? Well, from a realism standpoint, I don't see much advantage to this. It involves lowering the tanks, covering the wheels more, which would only make maintenance more difficult. Why go to the trouble of making an engine even more non-standard? Well, the reason goes back to creator Wilbert Awdry himself. Wilbert originally envisioned Thomas as a totally different engine, a J50 class. It was illustrator Reginald Payne that decided to draw Thomas like an E2 class, and content with this, Awdry allowed it. However, Payne made an error that forever irritated Awdry. He didn't lower the rear buffer beam to match the front's height. The real E2s had this, but Thomas didn't, making his front buffers much lower than his rear ones. This carried over to the TV series prop, and later CGI model. Awdry was a stickler for consistency. If an engine was drawn one way, then that's how he'd be drawn moving forward. He knew kids were smarter than people gave them credit for, and would notice differences between the books. But forever bothered by the varying buffer heights, he knew he'd have to write a story to somehow correct the issue. And thus, Thomas Comes to Breakfast. From this story onwards, Thomas forever has a flat running board for the rest of the books. This isn't unheard of for Awdry, as he did something very similar with Henry. He wrote a whole story where Henry crashed and had to be rebuilt, coming back from the works looking like a totally different engine. Awdry's stick to consistency is something to commend. This is a man who bothered to go to so much trouble just to raise a couple buffers. Rheneas has been the subject of quite a few of these debunked videos. He is quite the anomaly of a character. Did you know that Rheneas holds the record for the most different colors worn by a character throughout all of the Thomas franchise? He has indeed worn almost every color of the rainbow at some point in all of his various depictions. In the original books, Rheneas, like the rest of the Skarloey Railway engines, was painted red, a bright red with blue lining. In the first Skarloey-centric book, 4 Little Engines, The narrow gauge engines are depicted in more of a pinkish color, more so than red, complete with pinkish wheels to match. Interestingly, most of Rheneas' merchandise up until 2012 also depicted him in a similar bizarre pink livery, despite being orange in the show. And of course there's the TV show, which depicts Rheneas in a red-orange livery with gold lining. In the post-credits scene of the movie Blue Mountain Mystery, Rheneas shows up in a yellow paint job with blue lining as a joke on Thomas. In an annual story called The Good Old Days, Rheneas appears incorrectly with a purple livery for some odd reason. And while it's not Rheneas, Rheneas' real-life counterpart Dalgach has worn multiple shades of green in her working life. She is not actually Rheneas, but is spiritually the real-life Rheneas, so I'm gonna count it. Not to mention, Rheneas' prop in the TV series was reused for Smudger, who was also painted green. Again, it's not actually Rheneas, but still the Rheneas prop. It should be noted that James has also worn a significant number of liveries throughout the franchise, including red, of course, black, pink, and bee colors. He has worn blue, green, and other colors too, but these were all in a fantasy sequence, so I personally don't count them. If we only could get Rheneas to wear blue, then we could complete the Rheneas rainbow. Continuing off the last debunked regarding the real engine numbers in Thomas, let's cover some more. Let's first cover Boco, the big Class 28 diesel engine. In both the books and the TV show, Boco wears the number D7502. This was a real Class 28 built in 1958 and withdrawn 10 years later in 1968. Sadly, this 28 diesel was scrapped in real life. The big snobby Class 40 diesel that once visited Sodor was a real engine too, but funnily enough, only in the TV series. In the books, the diesel wore the number D4711, which, as far as I know, wasn't a real number. In the TV series, however, the diesel wore the number D261. This belonged to a real Class 40 that entered service in 1960, withdrawn around 1983, and sadly scrapped the year after. Victor, the little steamworks engine, is real too. In his original yellow livery, Victor wore the number 1173, which belongs to the actual engine Victor is based on. The engine was built by Baldwin Locomotive Works and spent its working life at a sugar mill in Cuba. Withdrawn in 1993, the engine was rescued in 2012 and is currently on display at the Patria Sugar Mill Museum. Merlin is a fun one. Merlin is based on a very specific King Arthur class of the Southern Railway, an experimental one with 3 smokestacks that allowed it to puff out large clouds of smoke and hide it from World War II bombers. The engine was numbered 783, as is Merlin. The real engine was named Sir Gilmere. Merlin, while he is meant to be this engine, has his name taken from another King Arthur class, number 740, Merlin. And lastly, let's cover Diesel. Diesel, of course, is never shown with a number. However, Sodor Island Models did an extraordinarily in-depth video really diving into which Class 08 Diesel is, doing extensive research into minor details in the class's variants. He came to the conclusion that Diesel is number 13236. This Class 08 is indeed preserved, and lives on the Battlefield Line Railway. That's right, Diesel survived, and you can go see him. Highly recommend checking out Sodor Island Models' video on the subject, it's very well put together. Crazy just how many real engines are in this funny talking train show, huh? This is one of the longest debated and most talked about theories in the Thomas universe. Are there actually 2 Henrys? We all know Henry's story. Henry was an experimental Gresley designed engine gone wrong that was sold to the Northwestern Railway cheap, whom at the time were in dire need of an express engine and would take whatever they could get their hands on. Henry didn't perform well, and after his infamous crash while pulling the Flying Kipper, was sent off to Crewe to be rebuilt entirely. The engine that returned from Crewe was no longer a Gresley designed experimental, but instead a Stanier designed Black 5. As Wilbert Awdry notes in the Island of Sodor book, it is a mystery as to how Sir Topham Hatt was able to make this happen. There is no way an engine that bared a resemblance to a Great Northern A1, a Pacific no less, would be able to be converted into a 10-wheeler Black 5. It's just not realistically possible. Wilbert also refers to these two Henrys as Henry I and Henry II, and many have taken this to mean that they are in fact different engines. If this were real life, surely that would be the case. Henry I was sent away and scrapped, and a brand new engine was purchased and took the number. However, Sir Topham dubs the new engine as Henry, and treats him as if he's the same engine. Why would he do this? Is it all an act? Is it to cover up the fact he scrapped one of his own so the other engines wouldn't know? Was it some sort of a tax fraud conspiracy? The only thing that debunks that being the case is that Henry II does carry the same personality and memories as Henry I. On many occasions, Henry II recalls events that occurred to him while he was in his old shape.
"Be careful, Henry," he said. "You're not pulling the flying kipper now. Mind you keep on the rails today."
He ran away singing, "Once an engine attached to a train was afraid of a few drops of rain."
Very clearly still the same character. Here's my answer to this theory. The engine that returned from Crewe is indeed the same engine that was sent there, just heavily standardized. A real-life example of this phenomenon would be the Taff Vale Railway tank engines. At one point, they looked like this, but after extensive rebuilds at Swindon, they were standardized and came out looking like this. They look completely different, but are still the same engines. That's how I view Henry. In this scenario, he would have had to been built as an experimental 10-wheeler design, as some of the illustrations do depict, and rebuilt by William Stanier with a Black 5 boiler, raised footplate, new tender, etc., etc. So that'd mean he isn't really a Black 5, he just closely resembles one. He is still a weird one-off, but also is still the same Henry. I, for one, could never believe Sir Topham would actually scrap one of his own engines. Thomas and Friends ran for 36 years, from 1984 to 2020, with a total of 24 seasons, with a total number of 597 episodes. This is including all special length episodes and spin-off episodes, and not the feature-length movies. Have you ever wondered how many of those episodes Thomas was not in? The answer may surprise you. Let's look at the stats. Of those 597, 477 are episodes where Thomas appears with a speaking role. 24 are episodes where he appears but doesn't speak. 42 are episodes where he only cameos in the background. And 4 are Big World Big Adventure era episodes in which he only appears as the narrator. There are also 2 episodes where he appears in only a deleted scene that was cut from the final episodes, but we won't count those. That gives us a grand total of 547 total appearances of the 597. That's an even 50 whole episodes in which Thomas does not appear in any way whatsoever. Roughly 8.3% of the entire series. Not too shabby for the main character, huh? Honestly, kinda surprised that total number isn't higher. Boco is the big friendly diesel engine that works on Edward's branch line. He is the antithesis to the all diesels are jerks stereotype, because he's the most kind-hearted and easygoing guy you'll ever meet. But did you know that Boco has an evil brother? You heard me right. Boco is one of the British Railways Class 28 diesels, a class of 20 diesels. These were all built in 1958 to 1959, and were numbered D5700 to D5719. Boco was D5702, and found his way to Sodor in the mid-60s. In the Railway series story, Escape, Oliver tells Douglas the tale of his daring escape from the Cutter's Torch, and how he ran across Britain in secrecy at night, all under the nose of British Railways. When Control found out about him, diesels were sent out to find him. One of the illustrations depicts Oliver and his crew hiding on a disused siding, while a cavalcade of evil-looking diesels peruse the line for him, baying and growling like hounds. One of these diesels is in fact a Class 28, the same as Boco. The diesel is wearing the British Railways Rail Blue livery from the 60s. This is very fascinating, because only a single Class 28 got this livery in real life. Number D7501, the number right before Boco. As only 128 got this livery in real life, the diesel in this illustration is certainly meant to be the real engine. D7501 was withdrawn in 1968 and was scrapped the year after. Only 128 survives in real life, D5705, which is based at the East Lancashire Railway, and Boco, of course, if you count him. I like to think that D7501 is like that estranged brother that Boco just prefers not to talk about. Talk about an awkward conversation, huh? Hey, by the way, Oliver, my brother tried to hunt you down once. Sorry. For the longest time, James was the sole red engine on the Northwestern Railway, and this is something he is extremely proud of. So, why is James red? When James first arrived on Sodor, he was still painted in black from his previous owners. He had an awful wreck early on that wasn't his fault, and to make him feel better, Sir Topham Hatt allowed James to stray away from the normal blue livery and be put into his own special one.
The Fat Controller was quite kind to James. The red paint will cheer you up after your accident.
Hence, the red, and he's kept it ever since. One has to wonder, though, why is James red? Who chose that color for him? And where did the livery come from? Well, here's my theory. In the books, James's livery is a scarlet red with exposed brass fittings, gold boiler banding, and dark blue lining, as seen here in these close-up illustrations. Do you know who else wears this exact color combination in the books? The Skarloey engines. The narrow-gauge Skarloey engines all wear a unified red livery, also with exposed gold brass and blue lining. My theory is that after James was rescued from his accident, he was sent to Crovan's Gate to be repaired, and while out in the yard awaiting his turn in the works, he spotted the little bright red Skarloey engines in their shed across the way. James took a liking to that color, and when Sir Topham asked him what livery he wanted, he told him he wanted that. We could say a real-life reason for James's livery is a homage to the Skarloey Railway, Sodor's other main railway. The liveries are just too similar to be coincidental, right? Just a theory, of course. Nothing official states that to be the case, and it only pertains to the books, as James wears black lining in the show, and the Skarloey engines don't have a unified livery. Perhaps the red is a reference to the LMS, the parent company of the region James worked in before Sodor. Who knows? What do you think his special red means? Who did Sir Topham Hatt marry? Well, Lady Hatt, of course, says all of you watching. But do you know the stories of all the Hatt ladies? In the books, the very first Fat Controller, aka Sir Topham Hatt I, married Jane Brown, who became Lady Jane Hatt. Jane is the sister of Sir Handel Brown, aka the original owner of the Skarloey Railway, and the man Sir Handel is named after. That's right, Topham went and married the sister of a competitor. Real smooth. This version of Lady Hatt is the one depicted in the TV series. Jane and Topham were married in 1910, and together they had 2 children, Barbara Jane and Charles. Charles would later go on to marry the love of his life, Amanda Crory, in 1940. When Charles inherited his father's baronetcy and became the controller in 1956, Amanda became the second Lady Hatt. Charles and Amanda had 2 children, Stephen and Bridget. An elderly Topham Hatt I and Jane would later take their 2 grandchildren on holiday to East Anglia, where they famously met Toby. Stephen married his distant cousin Helen Margaret. He became the 3rd controller years later in 1984, and inherited the baronetcy after Charles's passing in 1997. Helen became the 3rd Lady Hatt. They had 3 children together, Richard, Charles Nicholas, and Emily Helen. We don't know much about Richard and who he married, if he married at all, but we do know he is destined to become the 4th Fat Controller. Although in 2020, at the young whippersnapping age of 79, Stephen had still shown no signs of retiring. Henry, oh Henry, we always come back to you. Henry is one of the main characters in Thomas and Friends, and of course the book series it was based on, the Railway series. We recently talked about how many episodes of the series Thomas has appeared in, and he appeared in a lot of them. But what if I told you that Henry actually beat him in the books? Henry has appeared in the most stories of the Railway series, topping all other characters, some just by barely. Of the 169 stories, Henry has appeared in 43 stories with a speaking role, 10 stories where he appears but does not speak, and 6 where he just appears in an illustration with no mention. That is a grand total of 59 of the 169 stories, or roughly 34.9%. Considering this is an ensemble series where there is no main character, that's pretty damn good. For the sake of comparison, Thomas has appeared in 46 stories with a speaking role, 9 stories where he appears but does not speak, and 1 story where he appears in an illustration without mention. That's a total of 56 stories, or roughly 33.1% of the series. By just a bit more than a single percent, Henry has appeared more than Thomas. Now that's pretty dang crazy, huh? Thomas the Tank Engine came to be because he was based on a wooden train model Wilbert Awdry crafted for his son Christopher. The model had 6 wheels, was more tealish in color than blue, had a large bunker, and notably had large sloping side tanks that were flush with the front of the smokebox. Wilbert's original drawings for Thomas that he gave to his illustrator reflected this, depicting Thomas with those sloping tanks. This of course was changed when the illustrator, Reginald Payne, decided to base Thomas on an E2 class instead, and thus, the official design for Thomas was born, and the original was lost. Many have speculated what sort of engine the original Thomas was meant to be, and that's what we're going to do today. Let's find some potential prototypes. First up is the J50 class from the Great Northern Railway. I have said before in previous videos that this is what Thomas was supposed to be, although that has never been confirmed as fact. This 060 tank engine had those long tanks that slope at the front and meet the front of the smokebox. However, the J50's tanks only start to slope midway through the tanks, while the model's slope is the entirety of the tank's length. Next up is a Kitson-designed 060. This example was built for the Coppice Colliery, and coincidentally was also named Thomas. How do you like that? Unlike the J50, this one's side tanks do slope the entirety of the tank's length, much more akin to the model. Only issue on this guy is the lack of a bunker. The model clearly has a nice big one, and this guy does not. Next up, we have a Hudswell Clark designed 060. This particular example was built for the Manchester Ship Canal Railway, and is preserved. It's much more squat in length, more akin to the model, and its tanks also sloped almost the entirety of the tank's length. A much closer prototype, I reckon, but only falls short with its tiny bunker. But hey, at least it has one. No matter what, we'll never find a perfect match for the original Thomas, because honestly, I don't think the original Thomas was really based on anything. Any 060 slope tank engine would really do the job. It's completely up to your own interpretation. But if I were to choose one, I do think the Hudswell Clark is the closest thing out there. In the 38th book of the Railway series, Wilbert the Forest Engine, the Fat Controller decides to trial an Austerity tank engine on his railway. He brings over Wilbert, and is so pleased with Wilbert's performance that he decides an engine just like him is what he needs.
By the end of his stay, the Fat Controller knew that an engine like Wilbert was exactly what he needed.
This plot point is strangely forgotten about in the books, and this Austerity tank engine is never touched on again, or mentioned in any of the additional lore books. Who was the Austerity engine? Did the Fat Controller ever purchase one? Well, officially, there is no answer. However, we do have some information we can look to for a potential answer. Wilbert Awdry's own models. Most of the characters in the series came to be because they were based on existing models on Wilbert's 00 gauge layout. Duck, for instance, was based on a spare pannier tank model Wilbert just had and decided to turn into a character, 7 years after he bought the model. Stanley's story and fate is also based on what Wilbert did to his model of his cumbersome Baldwin tank. The point here is that Wilbert took a lot of inspiration for characters straight from the models in his collection. Wilbert did indeed have a model of an Austerity saddle tank engine on his layout to be used as a spare, as shown here. The model, named Warrington, was produced by Dapple in 1986, and is a model of a real preserved tank engine. As purchased, the model comes in a full green paint job. However, Wilbert had went ahead and repainted it blue. It's possible he was converting it into a model of the real-life Wilbert engine, and just never got around to finishing it. Regardless, he left the name Warrington on its sides. Could this Warrington be the mystery Austerity tank engine? Could the real-life Warrington have found its way to the island of Sodor in the early 90s and became one of the Northwestern's fleet? Likely not, and there's nothing official to confirm that, of course. But it is an interesting theory nonetheless. Have you ever wondered who all these random background engines are in the early books of the Railway series? None of them have been named or mentioned, and after a certain period, they just stop appearing altogether. Who are they, and what are their stories? Well, let's dive in a bit. So in reality, most of these engines are just byproducts of the time. Just engines to fill the background before the world of Sodor and its cast were all figured out by author Wilbert Awdry. However, he does give us some information that helps explain them away. In the first story of the first book, 6 engines appear in the shed. The green one is Henry, and the 2 on the other end are Gordon and Edward. Between them are 3 other engines. The 2 blue ones were known only by their numbers, 87546 and 98462. Both of these engines arrived on the Northwestern on trial, and were painted in the railway's blue livery. They, along with Gordon, were quite snobby and rude to Edward. They were eventually sent away by Sir Topham Hatt for being horrid, rude engines, and were never seen again. The red engine, along with a second red engine similar to James, shown later in the book trying to push Henry out of the tunnel, are both unknown. As per the original drawings Awdry provided the illustrator, the engine at the tunnel was meant to be Edward, or a similar 440, so we can probably write that red engine off as not canon. The first one, however, we could perhaps explain away as another engine on loan from the neighboring Furness Railway, hence the red livery. This was also the case for Edward before he was bought outright. Clearly the engine didn't work out, and left the railway at a certain point. Only issue is there weren't any double bogeyed tender engines with sloped front footplates on the Furness Railway, and the illustration depicts the engine with 2 sets of bogey wheels and a sloped front footplate. However, I have seen some fun fan art by Mr. Terrier 673 on Twitter that suggests that it could have been one of the Furness's 115 class Baltic tank engines, which I actually quite like. A little blue tank engine appears in the background of the book James the Red Engine in 2 illustrations. The engine appears to have an 044 wheel arrangement. This engine also could have been some sort of engine on trial, potentially from the neighboring Midland Railway, which had a vast assortment of 044 tank engines. I always thought this may have been one of the leftover Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway tank engines, but those were all recently confirmed to be Manning Wardle tanks and a Sharp Stewart 060. So many engines on Sodor, so little time to get to know them all.